The spring sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the mansion, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Elena wiped the sweat from her brow as she pushed her cleaning cart down the long hallway. 6 months into her job at the Thornton estate, and she still found herself getting lost in the massive house. "Third door on the right after the painting of the boat," she whispered to herself, trying to remember the housekeeper's directions. This wing of the house was rarely used, and today she had been assigned to dust the forgotten rooms that Mr. Thornton never visited. Elena had come to America 3 years ago with dreams bigger than the suitcase she carried, but life had other plans. Her father's sudden illness back home meant her music school money had to be sent back to her family instead. One emergency led to another, and soon the grand plans of becoming a concert pianist faded into the background, replaced by the practical needs of survival. The heavy wooden door creaked as Elena pushed it open. The musty smell of an unused room greeted her, along with dancing dust particles visible in the beams of light. She flicked on the light switch and gasped. In the center of the room stood the most beautiful piano she had ever seen, a glossy black Steinway grand piano, its lid closed and surface covered with a thin layer of dust. Elena's heart skipped a beat as she moved closer, her cleaning supplies momentarily forgotten. "Hello, beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers gently across the dusty surface, leaving trails behind. The piano reminded her of the one at the Moscow Conservatory, where she had spent countless hours practicing before life took an unexpected turn. With reverence, she opened the lid that covered the keys, revealing the perfect row of ivory and ebony. Elena glanced toward the door nervously. Mrs. Phillips, the head housekeeper, had strict rules about touching the family's belongings. "You are here to clean, not to snoop," she often reminded the staff. But this wasn't snooping, was it? Elena needed to dust the keys properly. At least, that's what she told herself as her fingers hovered over the piano, itching to feel the familiar touch of the keys beneath them. Just one note, she promised herself, just to see if it's in tune. Her index finger pressed down on middle C, and the clear, perfectly tuned note resonated through the room. Elena closed her eyes, savoring the sound that brought back a flood of memories. Before she realized what was happening, her cleaning rag was set aside, and she was sliding onto the bench, her posture automatically adjusting to the position that had been drilled into her since childhood. Just a few minutes, she thought. No one would know. The house was quiet. Mr. Thornton was at his office downtown. Mrs. Phillips was overseeing the gardeners on the grounds. The rest of the cleaning staff was working in the east wing. Elena's fingers touched the keys gently at first, playing a simple scale to get a feel for the instrument. The action was perfect, the sound rich and warm. This piano had been well maintained despite its apparent disuse. Emboldened by the privacy, she began to play softly, a simple melody from her childhood. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget. 3 years without regular practice, yet her hands moved with muscle memory built from thousands of hours at the keyboard. As she played, Elena felt the weight of her daily struggles lift. She was no longer a maid in an oversized uniform. She was a musician again, lost in the conversation between her soul and the instrument. She didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway over the sound of her playing. "What do you think you're doing?" Elena's hands froze mid-phrase as Mrs. Phillips's sharp voice cut through the music. She jumped up from the bench, nearly knocking it over. "I'm sorry, I was just—" Elena stammered, her accent thickening with nervousness. "You were just what? Playing with Mr. Thornton's expensive piano instead of doing your job?" Mrs. Phillips's thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that gets people fired, Elena." "Please, I need this job," Elena said quickly, picking up her discarded cleaning rag. "It won't happen again." Mrs. Phillips sighed, her stern expression softening slightly. "Listen, girl, I understand that pretty things catch the eye, but we have rules for a reason. Mr. Thornton pays good money, and in return, we respect his privacy and his belongings." "Yes, ma'am." Elena nodded, her cheeks burning with shame. "Finish cleaning this room and then move on to the library. And not another word about this, understood?" Elena nodded again, relief washing over her. At least she wasn't being fired on the spot. After Mrs. Phillips left, Elena carefully closed the piano lid and began dusting with extra thoroughness, as if trying to erase her momentary indiscretion. As she cleaned, her mind drifted back to her life before America. She had been studying piano since she was 5 years old, her talent recognized early by a teacher in her small hometown outside Moscow. By 16, she had been accepted to the prestigious Moscow Conservatory, her future bright with possibilities of concert halls and international competitions. Then came her father's heart attack. The family savings were quickly drained by medical bills. Elena's mother had called her in tears, apologizing for needing the tuition money they had scraped together. Without hesitation, Elena had sent everything home. For a while, she tried to keep up with her studies on scholarship, working odd jobs to support herself. But when her younger brother also needed surgery, the decision became clear. Elena withdrew from the conservatory, promising herself it was just temporary, and took a job offer from a Russian family friend in America. That temporary detour had stretched into years now. The family friend's restaurant had closed 6 months ago, leaving Elena scrambling for work. The housekeeping position at the Thornton estate paid well and included a small room in the staff quarters, a blessing she couldn't afford to lose. Elena moved the duster across the piano's gleaming surface, wondering about its owner. Richard Thornton was somewhat of a mystery to the household staff. At 42, he had built a technology empire from scratch, making him one of the city's wealthiest residents. Divorced with no children, he spent most of his time at the office, or traveling for business. The staff rarely saw him, receiving most of their instructions through Mrs. Phillips or his personal assistant. Elena had only glimpsed him a few times from a distance. A tall figure in expensive suits, always on his phone, moving quickly through the house like he was just passing through his own life. Why would someone own such a magnificent instrument and never play it? It seemed like such a waste. The sound of distant voices pulled Elena from her thoughts. She quickened her cleaning pace, determined to finish her assigned rooms on time. The incident with the piano had already put her behind schedule. Later that evening, as Elena carried a stack of freshly laundered towels to the linen closet, she overheard 2 other maids talking. "Did you hear? Mr. Thornton is hosting a dinner party this weekend," said the first maid, a woman named Lily who had worked at the estate for years. "Another business thing?" asked the second, a younger girl named Beth. "What else?" "The man doesn't seem to have friends, just business associates," Lily replied with a shrug. "Mrs. Phillips says we'll all be working late. Double pay at least." Elena continued down the hallway, wondering what kind of life Mr. Thornton led. All that money and success, yet from what the staff observed, very little joy. The grand piano. Collecting dust seemed like a perfect symbol of his life, something beautiful and valuable, left untouched. That night in her small staff room, Elena took out the worn photo of her family that she kept beside her bed. Her parents' proud faces at her last recital before everything changed. Her younger brother and sister, now teenagers she barely recognized in the occasional video calls. The money she sent home each month helped them, but the distance grew with each passing year. She fell asleep thinking about the piano, her fingers moving slightly against the blanket as if playing an invisible keyboard. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as the staff prepared for the weekend dinner party. Extra hands were brought in to polish silver, arrange flowers, and make sure every inch of the public rooms gleamed with perfection. Elena was assigned to prepare the guest bathrooms and bedrooms in case any visitors stayed overnight. As she worked, she hummed softly to herself, melodies from her conservatory days that never quite left her. On Friday afternoon, while Elena was changing sheets in one of the guest rooms, Mrs. Phillips appeared in the doorway. "Elena, I need to speak with you," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Elena's stomach dropped. Had she decided to tell Mr. Thornton about the piano incident after all? "Yes, Mrs. Phillips," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "For tomorrow's dinner party, we're short-staffed in the serving department. 2 people called in sick. I know you usually work upstairs, but I need you to help serve drinks and appetizers." Relief flooded through Elena. "Of course I can. Do that." "Good. Maria will show you the proper serving technique in the morning. Remember, this is an important event for Mr. Thornton. These guests are potential investors. Everything must be perfect." After Mrs. Phillips left, Elena sat on the edge of the freshly made bed, her mind racing. Serving at the party meant she would be visible to the guests and to Mr. Thornton himself. The thought made her nervous, but also a little excited for the change in routine. Little did she know that the upcoming dinner party would change the course of her life forever, all because of a wealthy man's careless joke and a dust-covered piano that was about to find its voice again. The kitchen buzzed with activity as staff hurried back and forth, putting final touches on elaborate appetizer trays. Elena stood awkwardly in her new uniform, a crisp black dress with a white apron, different from her usual cleaning attire. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and for the first time since starting at the mansion, she wore a touch of makeup. "Remember, always serve from the left, clear from the right," Maria instructed, demonstrating with an empty tray. "And for heaven's sake, try not to make eye contact with the guests unless they speak to you directly." Elena nodded, absorbing every detail. The serving job might be temporary, but she was determined to do it well. 6 hours of training had filled her head with rules about proper serving etiquette, but Maria seemed pleased with her progress. "You'll be on drinks duty first," Maria continued. "Just walk around with the champagne tray and make sure no one's glass is empty. Simple enough?" "Yes?" "Yes, I think I can manage that," Elena replied, practicing holding the tray with one hand as she had been shown. From the main hall came the sound of the doorbell. The first guests had arrived. Places, everyone. Mrs. Phillips clapped her hands. "Remember, we represent the Thornton household. Professionalism at all times." Elena took a deep breath and picked up a tray of champagne flutes. The bubbles caught the light from the crystal chandelier as she made her way to the grand foyer, where guests were beginning to gather. Richard Thornton stood at the entrance, greeting each arrival with practiced charm. Elena had never been this close to him before. Up close, she noticed the tired lines around his eyes that his confident smile couldn't quite hide. He was handsome in the way powerful men often are, not by nature but by the way they carried themselves, dressed themselves, presented themselves to the world. The guests were just as Elena had imagined them, women draped in jewelry that could pay her family's medical bills for years, men in suits that cost more than she earned in months. They laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, complimented the house with thinly veiled envy, and took champagne from her tray without acknowledging her existence. Elena moved through the growing crowd like a ghost, invisible except when needed. She kept the glasses filled and listened to snippets of conversation about stock prices, property investments, and someone's new yacht. The wealthy truly lived in a different world. "Richard, this place gets more impressive every time I visit," said a heavy-set man with a booming voice. "You've added some new artwork since I was here last, haven't you?" Mr. Thornton nodded, guiding the man toward a painting on the far wall. "Good eye, Thomas. That's a Renoir I acquired last month. Small piece, but authentic." "Always the collector," Thomas chuckled. "Cars, art, real estate, what's next? I heard you even have a piano collection now?" Elena's ears perked up at the mention of pianos. She slowed her pace, lingering within earshot while pretending to arrange her tray. "Just the one grand piano, actually," Mr. Thornton replied with a dismissive wave. "It came with the East Wing renovation. Interior designer insisted it completed the music room." "Do you play?" asked a woman in a red dress, joining their conversation. "Mr. Thornton laughed. "Not a note. The thing just sits there collecting dust." "What a waste," the woman said. "My daughter took lessons for years and we could barely afford an upright. Meanwhile, you've got a concert grand gathering dust." Something flickered across Mr. Thornton's face, embarrassment perhaps, or discomfort at being called out on his excess. Elena watched as he took a long sip of his drink, clearly searching for a way to change the subject. Instead, Thomas wouldn't let it go. "So, you bought a piano you can't play? That's rich even for you, Richard." The small group around them laughed, and Elena could see Mr. Thornton's jaw tighten slightly. He wasn't used to being the butt of jokes. For a man who controlled every aspect of his life, this small social humiliation clearly stung. "I'm sure I could learn if I had the time," he said stiffly. "It can't be that difficult. I bet even my housekeeping staff could manage it." His eyes swept the room and landed on Elena, who froze like a deer in headlights, champagne tray still in hand. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The first time he had actually looked at her, really seen her, since she began working in his home. "You there?" he called out, gesturing for her to approach. "What's your name?" Elena's heart hammered in her chest as she carefully walked over, conscious of every step, terrified of spilling the drinks. "Elena, sir." "Elena," he repeated as if trying out the name. "Tell me, do you play the piano?" The room seemed to go quiet, though Elena knew it was just her own panic drowning out the other sounds. She could lie, say no, and be dismissed back to her invisible role, or she could tell the truth and risk reminding Mrs. Phillips of the incident in the music room. "I used to play a little, sir," she said carefully, deciding on a half-truth. Mr. Thornton's eyebrows raised slightly, as if he hadn't expected that answer. A smile spread across his face, not warm but calculating. Elena recognized it immediately as the smile of someone who had just found a way to divert attention from themselves. "Well then," he announced to the small crowd, his voice carrying enough that nearby conversations paused. "It seems we have an unexpected talent in our midst. Perhaps we should have some entertainment with dessert?" Elena's stomach dropped. "Sir, I haven't played in years. I couldn't possibly—" "Nonsense," he interrupted, taking her champagne tray and handing it to another passing server. "I insist. It'll be a charming addition to the evening." The woman in red looked uncomfortable. "Richard, don't put the poor girl on the spot like that." But Mr. Thornton had already made up his mind. Elena could see it in his expression. This was no longer a request but a command. He was her employer, and refusing wasn't an option without risking her job. "After dinner, then," he said with finality. "Elena will favor us with a little music." With that, he steered his guests toward the dining room, leaving Elena standing alone, her hands shaking slightly. Mrs. Phillips appeared at her side almost instantly. "What was that about?" she whispered harshly. "Mr. Thornton wants me to play the piano after dinner," Elena explained, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Phillips's eyes widened. "Is this because of what happened in the music room? Did you tell him you could play?" "No, he just asked, and I couldn't lie to his face," Elena said desperately. "What should I do?" The older woman sighed, glancing toward the dining room where the guests were taking their seats. "You'll do as he asks, of course, but for goodness sake, keep it simple. Just play a little tune and be done with it. The last thing we need is you showing off and embarrassing him." Elena nodded, though her mind was racing. The thought of playing that magnificent piano was both thrilling and terrifying. But to do it in front of an audience of judging wealthy strangers, and after 3 years of barely touching a keyboard, seemed impossible. Throughout dinner service, Elena moved mechanically, serving plates and clearing courses without really seeing them. Her thoughts were on the music room, on the feel of those perfect keys beneath her fingers. What could she play that would be simple enough not to embarrass herself, but good enough not to embarrass Mr. Thornton? As the dessert plates were cleared and coffee was served, Mr. Thornton stood at the head of the table. The conversations quieted as he tapped his spoon against his crystal glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've arranged a small entertainment for us this evening," he announced with the confidence of someone who was never denied anything. "One of my staff has kindly agreed to demonstrate her piano skills." All eyes turned to Elena, who stood by the sideboard, wishing she could disappear. She saw amusement in some faces, pity in others. They expected a simple maid to stumble through chopsticks or a basic nursery rhyme. "This way to the music room," Mr. Thornton continued, gesturing grandly as if introducing a circus act. The guests rose from their seats, wine and coffee cups in hand, and followed him down the hallway. Elena trailed behind, her legs feeling like lead. Mrs. Phillips caught her arm as she passed. Remember, keep it simple, she warned again. Just a minute or two, then you can go back to your duties. Elena nodded, but something was shifting inside her. As they approached the music room, her secret place of refuge that one precious afternoon, a calm began to settle over her nervousness. These people with their wealth and privilege thought they knew what to expect from her. They saw the uniform, not the person wearing it. For a moment she thought of her father, who had worked extra shifts at the factory to pay for her first piano lessons. Of her mother, who had sat beside her at every childhood recital, squeezing her hand 3 times before she walked on stage, their secret code for, "I love you." The music room looked different in the evening, lit by soft lamps rather than harsh daylight. The piano gleamed under the gentle light, its lid propped open. Mr. Thornton positioned himself beside it, playing the generous host as his guests found places to stand or perch around the room. "Elena here tells me she plays a little," he said, with a smirk that made it clear he expected little indeed. "I thought we might enjoy some simple music with our after-dinner drinks." He gestured toward the piano bench as one might invite a child to perform a cute trick. "Whenever you're ready, Elena." Elena walked slowly to the piano, aware of every eye upon her. She sat down at the bench, adjusting it slightly from muscle memory. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment as she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. In that breath, a decision was made. She would not play a little tune. She would not pretend to be less than she was to make these people comfortable in their assumptions. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor filled the room, soft and delicate like raindrops on a window. Elena's fingers moved with a gentle confidence that surprised even her after so many years away from a proper piano. The muscle memory was there, buried beneath years of scrubbing floors and folding laundry, but still intact. She kept her eyes, closed at first, too afraid to see the reactions of the wealthy audience gathered around her. Instead, she focused on the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, the perfect weight and resistance of the expensive instrument responding to her touch. The beginning of the piece was deceptively simple, a melody that flowed like water. Elena could feel herself settling into it, her breathing steadying as the music transported her back to the practice rooms of the Moscow Conservatory. For these moments, she wasn't a maid in a borrowed black dress. She was a musician again. As the piece progressed into its more complex middle section, Elena finally opened her eyes. The room had gone completely silent. Even the soft clink of coffee cups had stopped. 20 pairs of eyes stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to wonder. Mr. Thornton stood frozen beside the piano, his champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips, his eyes wide with astonishment. The smug smile he'd worn when introducing her had vanished entirely. Elena's confidence grew with each measure. The faster passages that had once required hours of practice now flowed from her fingers as if she'd never stopped playing. The music swelled and receded, telling its story of longing and passion and grief. Mrs. Phillips stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. The other household staff had gathered behind her, peeking into the room to witness the transformation of their quiet colleague into this commanding presence at the keyboard. As Elena approached the thunderous climax of the piece, she felt something breaking open inside her. 3 years of buried dreams, of pretending to be less than she was, of shrinking herself to fit into the boxes others had built around her. All of it poured into the music. Her fingers flew across the keys with growing intensity, building toward the powerful conclusion. When the final notes resonated through the room, Elena's hands stilled above the keys. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke. The silence was absolute, as if everyone in the room had collectively forgotten to breathe. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone began to clap. Others joined in, the applause growing until it filled the room completely. A few guests rose to their feet, including the woman in the red dress who had earlier criticized Mr. Thornton for his unused piano. Elena remained seated, her hands now folded in her lap, her heart pounding. She hadn't meant to play the entire piece. She certainly hadn't meant to play it with such abandon. Mrs. Phillips' warning to keep it simple echoed in her mind, and she glanced nervously at her employer. Mr. Thornton's face was unreadable. He seemed almost dazed, staring at Elena as if seeing her for the first time. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, setting down his untouched champagne on a side table. "That was," he began, then cleared his throat. "That was unexpected." The heavy-set man named Thomas clapped him on the back. "Good God, Richard, you've been hiding a concert pianist in your housekeeping staff? That wasn't a little playing. That was extraordinary." The woman in red approached Elena, who still hadn't moved from the piano bench. "My dear, where did you learn to play like that? That was Chopin's G minor ballad, wasn't it? Perfectly executed." Elena nodded, feeling her cheeks flush. "Yes, ma'am. I studied at the Moscow Conservatory for a while." "The Moscow Conservatory?" another guest exclaimed. "That's one of the premier music schools in the world." The room erupted in chatter as guests pressed closer, suddenly interested in the maid they'd ignored all evening. Questions flew at Elena from all directions. Why was she working as a housekeeper? How long had she studied? Why had she stopped playing? Mrs. Phillips pushed through the crowd and placed a protective hand on Elena's shoulder. "I'm sure we've all enjoyed this lovely surprise, but Elena has duties to attend to. If you'll excuse her." "Nonsense," said the woman in red. "The girl just gave us a world-class performance. At the very least, she deserves to join us for a drink." Mr. Thornton had remained unusually quiet throughout this exchange. Now he stepped forward, running his hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up slightly in a rare display of discomposure. "Elena," he said, his voice lower than before, "would you play something else for us?" It wasn't an order this time, but a request. The arrogance had drained from his tone, replaced by something that sounded almost like humility. Elena looked to Mrs. Phillips, who gave a slight nod of resignation. "One more piece," Elena agreed, turning back to the keys. This time she chose Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece that showcased the piano's magnificent tone and her delicate touch. As she played, she noticed guests closing their eyes, some swaying slightly to the dreamy melody. The atmosphere in the room had transformed from the forced social politeness of a business dinner to something genuine and unexpected. When she finished the second piece, the applause was even more enthusiastic. Mr. Thornton's business associates seemed to have forgotten the purpose of their gathering entirely, now clustering around the piano with requests and compliments. "Rachmaninoff? Do you know any Liszt? Can you play something Russian?" Elena found herself smiling, warmed by their enthusiasm despite her lingering nervousness. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her music, had recognized this central part of her identity that she'd been forced to suppress. "Perhaps one more," she conceded, choosing a lively Schubert impromptu that showcased both technical skill and musical sensitivity. As she played, she noticed Mr. Thornton watching her from the edge of the room. His expression had shifted from shock to something more complex, a mixture of admiration, confusion, and what might have been shame. He caught her glance and quickly looked away again, uncomfortable under her gaze. The evening continued with Elena at the center of attention, something that clearly surprised Mr. Thornton, who was used to being the focal point at his own gatherings. The original purpose of the dinner, discussing potential investments, seemed forgotten as guests pulled up chairs around the piano, requested favorite pieces, and shared stories of concerts they'd attended. Elena played for nearly an hour, her earlier nervousness replaced by the joy of reconnecting with her passion. The other household staff watched from the doorway with expressions of pride and amazement, seeing their colleague in an entirely new light. Finally, Mrs. Phillips stepped in firmly. "It's getting late, and I'm sure our guests will want to be heading home soon." The spell broken, guests checked watches and made surprised noises at the time. As they began gathering belongings and saying goodbyes, many made a point of approaching Elena to thank her personally. "You should be on stage, not cleaning houses," one older gentleman told her, pressing a business card into her hand. "My brother sits on the board of the Symphony Society. Call him." The woman in red embraced her warmly. "Magnificent, my dear. Simply magnificent. What a waste of talent." Hiding you away in this house? Elena accepted their compliments graciously, but felt increasingly uncomfortable as comments about her wasted talent and questions about why she was just a maid continued. These well-meaning people couldn't understand the complex circumstances that had led her here, the choices made, out of love and necessity rather than preference. As the last guest departed, Elena began to quietly close the piano lid. The room had emptied except for Mr. Thornton, who stood by the doorway watching her with that same unreadable expression. "Leave it open," he said suddenly. "The piano, leave it open." Elena paused, her hands still resting on the polished wood. "Sir?" "It shouldn't be closed up like that, not anymore." He took a few steps into the room, then stopped, maintaining his distance. "How long have you worked here, Elena?" 6 months, sir." "And in that time, have you ever played this piano before tonight?" Elena hesitated, remembering her secret afternoon session that had been interrupted by Mrs. Phillips. "Just once, sir. I was caught and told not to touch it again." Mr. Thornton nodded slowly. "Of course you were." He looked around the room as if seeing it differently. "Do you know how much this piano cost?" "No, sir." "Neither do I," he admitted with a small, humorless laugh. "My interior designer chose it. Said a music room needed a proper grand piano. I just signed the check." He walked closer to the instrument, running his fingers lightly over its glossy surface the way Elena had done that first day. "It's never been played like that. Not once, since it was delivered. I didn't even know it could sound like that." There was something vulnerable in his voice that Elena had never heard before from this powerful man. For the first time, she saw him not as Mr. Thornton, the millionaire businessman, but as Richard, a human being capable of being moved by music. "Why are you working as a housekeeper, Elena?" he asked quietly. "Someone with your talent." It doesn't make sense. The question hung in the air between them. Before Elena could formulate an answer, Mrs. Phillips appeared in the doorway. "Elena, we need help in the kitchen with cleanup," she said firmly, though her tone was gentler than usual. "Mr. Thornton, I'm sure you're tired after hosting such a successful evening." Mr. Thornton waved her away. "In a moment, Mrs. Phillips." He turned back to Elena, and for the first time that evening, looked directly into her eyes without discomfort or embarrassment. "Tomorrow morning I'd like to speak with you in my office, 9 o'clock. "Yes, sir," Elena replied, her stomach tightening with anxiety. Was he angry about her performance? Had she embarrassed him somehow? Or was it something else entirely, as she followed Mrs. Phillips to the kitchen, leaving Mr. Thornton alone with his thoughts in the music room? Elena couldn't help wondering if her impulsive decision to play seriously rather than simplistically had just cost her the job she desperately needed. Elena barely slept that night. She tossed and turned in her small bed in the staff quarters, replaying the evening's events in her mind. The feeling of the piano keys beneath her fingers, the stunned expressions on the guests' faces, and most of all, the strange, unreadable look in Mr. Thornton's eyes when he requested to meet with her. Was she about to be fired? It seemed possible. She had shown up her employer, made him look foolish in front of his important guests. Rich men like Richard Thornton didn't appreciate being upstaged, especially not by the help. Or perhaps he wanted to parade her in front of more of his friends, turn her into some kind of party trick. "Look at my talented maid." The thought made her stomach turn. When her alarm went off at 6, Elena had been awake for hours. She dressed carefully in her standard uniform, pulling her hair back neatly and avoiding the makeup she'd worn for the dinner party. Better to look professional for whatever was coming. The morning routine in the mansion continued as usual. Staff bustled about, cleaning up the last traces of the previous night's event. Several of Elena's co-workers smiled at her or patted her shoulder as they passed, small gestures of support that touched her deeply. "That was something else last night," Lily whispered as they crossed paths in the hallway. "Never seen Mrs. Phillips so shocked in all my years here. Or Mr. Thornton," added Beth, who was helping to carry away vases of flowers. "Did you see his face? Like he'd seen a ghost." Elena managed a weak smile but couldn't bring herself to join in their excitement. Too much hung in the balance. At exactly 8:55, she made her way to Mr. Thornton's home office. She had never been inside before. Housekeeping staff were only allowed to clean it when he was away from the house. She knocked softly on the heavy wooden door. "Come in," called Mr. Thornton's voice from inside. Elena entered, immediately struck by the contrast between this room and the rest of the mansion. While most of the house was designed to impress with its grandeur, this space felt genuinely lived in. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled not with decorative leather-bound volumes, but with well-used books, their spines cracked from reading. A large desk dominated the center, covered with papers and folders rather than artfully arranged objects. Mr. Thornton sat behind the desk, wearing casual clothes rather than his usual suit. Jeans and a simple button-down shirt that made him look younger and less intimidating. He gestured to a chair across from him. "Please sit down." Elena perched on the edge of the chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. Neither spoke for a moment. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Mr. Thornton finally cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words coming out awkwardly as if he wasn't used to saying them. Of all the ways Elena had imagined this conversation beginning, an apology wasn't one of them. She blinked in surprise but remained silent. "What I did last night was inappropriate," he continued. "Putting you on the spot like that, making you perform for my guests. It was thoughtless and disrespectful. I'm sorry." "It's all right, sir," Elena said automatically, the response of someone accustomed to smoothing things over with employers. "No, it's not all right," he insisted, leaning forward. "I made a joke at your expense without considering how it might affect you." "I never expected—" He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "Well, I certainly never expected what happened." Elena shifted in her seat, unsure how to respond. "I hope I didn't embarrass you, sir." "Embarrass me?" Mr. Thornton let out a short laugh. "You gave my guests the most memorable evening they've had in my home. Thomas called me this morning to say it was the first time one of my dinner parties hadn't bored him to tears." A small smile tugged at Elena's lips despite her nervousness. "I'm glad they enjoyed it." "They more than enjoyed it. They were captivated." He studied her face for a moment. "As was I." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder. "After everyone left last night, I did some research. The Moscow Conservatory is one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Their acceptance rate is less than 5%. Elena nodded, a lump forming in her throat at the mention of the school she'd loved so much. "I'm trying to understand," he continued, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "How does someone go from studying at the Moscow Conservatory to cleaning my house? What happened, Elena?" The question was asked without judgment, just genuine curiosity. Perhaps it was his unexpected kindness, or the events of the previous night, or simply the weight of carrying her story alone for so long. But Elena found herself wanting to answer honestly. "My father had a heart attack," she said quietly. "The medical bills. My family used all their savings. Then my younger brother needed surgery too." She looked down at her hands, calloused now from work rather than piano practice. "The choice wasn't difficult. Family comes first." Mr. Thornton nodded slowly. "So you left school to help them?" "I thought it would be temporary," Elena admitted. "Just a year or two until they got back on their feet. But then one thing led to another and—" She gestured vaguely at her uniform. "Here I am. Do you still send money home?" "Every month. My father can't work full-time anymore and my mother's salary isn't enough. My brother and sister are still in school." Mr. Thornton leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "And in all this time you haven't played? Before last night, I mean." "Not really. Sometimes I practice on tabletops." Elena smiled sadly. "Drawing the keys with my finger, trying to keep the muscle memory alive. But a real piano, no. There was one at the restaurant where I worked before here, but it was badly out of tune." "That's why you were playing mine that day, Mrs. Phillips." "Caught you?" Elena's head snapped up in surprise. "You know about that. She mentioned it this morning when I asked about you." A small smile played at his lips. "She thought I was going to fire you and came to your defense." Quite passionately, I might add. She did. Elena couldn't hide her shock. Mrs. Phillips had always seemed so stern. Apparently, you're an excellent housekeeper on top of being a brilliant pianist. She'd hate to lose you. He tapped his fingers on the desk, a rhythm that suggested he was working through something in his mind. But that's the question, isn't it? Whether you should be a housekeeper at all? Elena's stomach tightened. Here it was. She was about to lose her job after all. Sir, if you're letting me go, I understand, but I really need this position. I can promise I won't touch the piano again without permission. Mr. Thornton looked genuinely startled. Let you go? No, that's not what I meant, at all. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Elena, what happened last night made me realize something. That piano in my music room, I bought it because that's what wealthy people do. They have music rooms with grand pianos, even if they never play a note. It's just expected. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured grounds of his estate. I have a lot of things like that. Things I own because I'm supposed to. Not because they bring me any joy or serve any purpose. It took watching you play to make me see how empty that is. He turned back to face her. You breathed life into that instrument. You made it sing in a way I didn't even know was possible. And it made me wonder how many other things in my life are just sitting there collecting dust, waiting for the right person to come along and show their true value. Elena remained silent, not sure where this philosophical turn was leading. I have a proposal for you, Mr. Thornton said, returning to his desk. I'd like to offer you a different position here at the house. A different position? Elena repeated, confused. As the house musician, he said simply. Same salary, better. Hours. Your only job would be to play that piano. Practice, perform when I have guests if you're comfortable with that. Maybe even give me a lesson or two if you're feeling particularly patient. Elena's mind reeled at the unexpected offer. You want to pay me to play piano? Yes. It seems like a much better use of your talents than making beds, doesn't it? His expression grew more serious. I know it's not the same as performing on a concert stage or teaching at a conservatory. Those opportunities may come later if you want them. This is just a first step, a way for you to reconnect with your music without sacrificing your ability to support your family. Elena couldn't find words. The possibility of playing every day, of having the magnificent Steinway at her disposal, of not having to hide this essential part of herself anymore, it was overwhelming. I understand if you need time to think about it, Mr. Thornton added when she didn't respond. It's a big change. No, Elena said quickly, finding her voice. I don't need time. I would love to accept. For the first time since she'd known him, Richard Thornton smiled genuinely, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Excellent. We can work out the details this week. When would you like to start? Now? Elena suggested, unable to keep the eagerness from her voice. Mr. Thornton laughed. A real laugh, not the polite chuckle he used at social gatherings. I had a feeling you might say that. He glanced at his watch. I have a conference call in 10 minutes, but after that, I'd love to hear you play again. Something of your choosing this time, not forced on you at a party. As Elena left his office, her mind was already filled with music, mentally sorting through pieces she wanted to revisit after so long away from the piano. The hallway that had seemed so intimidating just an hour ago now felt full of possibility. She nearly collided with Mrs. Phillips, who was waiting just outside the door. Well? The older woman asked, concern evident in her usually stern face. What did he say? I'm going to be the house musician, Elena replied, still not quite believing the words as she said them. Mrs. Phillips's expression softened. Are you now? Well, that's something. She adjusted her apron with a businesslike gesture, but Elena could see the smile she was trying to hide. I suppose we'll need to find someone else to do the upstairs bathrooms then. I can still help out sometimes, Elena offered. I don't mind. Nonsense, you have more important things to do now. Mrs. Phillips patted her arm awkwardly, a rare gesture of affection. You know, I've worked in houses like this for 40 years. Never thought I'd see the day when one of us got to step through that door. She nodded toward the invisible line that separated staff from the wealthy world they served. Don't waste it, girl. Show him what you're really made of. As Mrs. Phillips walked away, Elena felt something shift inside her, hope taking root. Where resignation had lived for so long, the path ahead wasn't clear yet, but for the first time in years she could hear the music calling her home. 6 months later, the music room had transformed completely. Gone was the museum-like stillness that had once defined it. Now, sheet music covered the polished side table. A comfortable reading chair had been added by the window, and the piano lid remained permanently open, ready to be played at any moment. Elena's fingers danced across the keys, working through a challenging passage of a Rachmaninoff concerto. She had been practicing this piece for weeks, pushing herself to regain the technical skills that had grown rusty during her years away from music. She was so absorbed in her playing that she didn't notice Mr. Thornton, Richard, as he now asked her to call him, standing in the doorway. Only when she paused to make a note on her music did she glance up and see him. "Don't stop on my account," he said, entering the room. That sounded wonderful. Elena smiled, no longer nervous in his presence as she once had been. "It's still rough. The left-hand arpeggios are giving me trouble." "Sounded perfect to me," Richard replied, taking a seat in the chair across from the piano. "But then again, I'm the guy who couldn't tell a C major from a dog barking 6 months ago." They both laughed, comfortable in the easy friendship that had developed between them since that night that changed everything. True to his word, Richard had created the position of house musician for Elena. Her days were now spent practicing, performing occasionally for guests, and giving Richard piano lessons 3 times a week. "You're getting better," Elena told him. "You can play Fur Elise without looking at your hands now." "The first page anyway," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm never going to be a concert pianist, but I'm enjoying it more than I expected." That was an understatement. Richard had thrown himself into learning piano with the same determination he brought to his business dealings. His progress was slow but steady, and his appreciation for music had deepened immensely. "Actually," he said, pulling an envelope from his pocket, "I have something for you." Elena took the envelope curiously. Inside was a printed email confirmation for 2 airline tickets to Moscow, dated for the following month. "What is this?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "I thought it was time you visited your family," Richard explained. "It's been, 4 years since you've seen them in person?" Elena nodded, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. "Almost 5. The tickets are for you and a guest of your choice, maybe Lily or Beth. 2 weeks in Moscow, all expenses paid, and don't worry about your salary while you're gone. Consider it a paid vacation." Elena stared at the tickets, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Richard, this is too much." "It's not nearly enough," he countered gently. "You've transformed this house. With your music. The least I can do is make sure you get to hug your parents and see how your brother and sister have grown." She looked up at him, seeing the genuine warmth in his eyes. This was not the same man who had casually humiliated her at a dinner party 6 months ago. That man had been hiding behind his wealth and status, using them as a shield against real, human connection. This Richard had learned to listen not just to music but to people. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing he understood the depth of gratitude behind those 2 words. "There's something else," Richard said, suddenly looking nervous. "I've invited someone to hear you play tomorrow evening, an old college friend of mine who happens to be on the board of the symphony orchestra." Elena's eyes widened. "Richard? Just to listen, that's all," he assured her quickly. "No pressure. But Vincent heard the recording I made of you playing the Chopin last month, and he practically invited himself over, said he hasn't heard talent like yours in years." Since becoming the house musician, Elena had gradually started dreaming again. Small dreams at first, mastering pieces she had abandoned years ago, reconnecting with the joy of music for its own sake. But lately, larger dreams had begun to take shape in her mind. Dreams of performing for real audiences again, of teaching students who shared her passion. Do you think I'm ready for something like that? She asked, voicing the insecurity that still lingered despite her progress. Richard leaned forward in his chair. Elena, you were ready the first night you played in this room. You've always been ready. The only thing holding you back was circumstance, and maybe a bit of fear. He wasn't wrong. As much as Elena had yearned to return to music, a part of her had been afraid. Afraid of failure, of disappointment, of reaching for her dreams only to have them slip through her fingers again. What if I mess up? She asked quietly. Then you mess up, Richard shrugged. Vincent isn't coming to judge you. He's coming because I wouldn't stop talking about my amazing house musician until he agreed to hear you play. He smiled warmly. But you won't mess up. You'll be brilliant, just like you are every day in this room. Elena took a deep breath, then nodded. Okay, I'll play for him. Excellent. Now can I make a special request for tomorrow's program? Of course. That Debussy piece, the Moonlight one. It was the first time I really understood what music could be. Claire de Lune, Elena nodded. I'd be happy to play it. Later that evening, after Richard had left for a business dinner, Elena returned to the music room. The house was quiet, most of the staff having finished their duties for the day. She sat at the piano, not to practice but to think. Looking around the room that had become her sanctuary, Elena marveled at how much had changed in 6 months. She now had a comfortable apartment in the city, though she spent most days at the mansion. Her family was doing better with the steady support she continued to provide. And she had music back in her life, not just as a distant memory, but as her daily reality. She opened her phone to the photos her mother had sent that morning. Her parents looked older than she remembered, her father's hair now completely gray. Her siblings had grown into teenagers she barely recognized. The thought of seeing them all in person next month filled her with nervous excitement. Elena began to play softly, not following any sheet music, just letting her fingers find their way. The melody that emerged was something new, her own composition that had been taking shape over the past few weeks. It spoke of loss and rediscovery, of dreams deferred but not abandoned. As she played, she thought about the strange winding path that had brought her here. If someone had told her a year ago that the arrogant millionaire who barely noticed her existence would become her friend and champion, she would have laughed in disbelief. If they had said she would be preparing to play for the symphony board, she would have called it a cruel joke. Yet here she was, poised at the edge of a new beginning that had seemed impossible just months ago. The following evening, Elena dressed, carefully in a simple black dress, purchased with her own money, not borrowed this time. She arranged her hair in a neat updo and applied just enough makeup to feel polished but not overdone. This was not a performance for show. It was a statement of who she truly was. When she entered the music room, Richard was already there with his friend Vincent, a distinguished-looking man with kind eyes and an attentive expression. Unlike the dinner party guests who had seen her as a curiosity, Vincent watched her approach, with the respectful gaze of someone who took music seriously. Elena, this is Vincent Chen, an old friend and a true music lover, Richard introduced them. Vincent, this is Elena Morales, the musician I've been telling you about. It's a pleasure to meet you, Vincent said, shaking her hand warmly. Richard has spoken very highly of your talent. I'm looking forward to hearing you play. Thank you for coming, Elena replied, surprised by how calm she felt. This moment, which would have terrified her 6 months ago, now felt right, as if she was exactly where she was meant to be. She took her place at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. Looking up, she caught Richard's encouraging smile from across the room. How strange that the man who had once humiliated her with a thoughtless joke had become the person who believed in her most completely. Elena began with Claire de Lune, as Richard had requested, letting the familiar notes flow from her fingers like water. From there she moved to Chopin, then to a Russian piece her father had loved when she was a child. She played not to impress but to communicate, to share the language that had always made the most sense to her. When she finally finished with her own composition, still unnamed, still evolving, The room was silent for a long moment. Vincent sat completely still, his eyes closed as the final notes faded away. "Well," he said finally, opening his eyes to look at Elena with undisguised admiration, "I think we have a lot to talk about." Later, after Vincent had left with promises of auditions and introductions, Elena and Richard stood by the piano together, a bottle of champagne opened between them. "To new beginnings," Richard toasted, raising his glass, "and to unexpected friendships," Elena added, touching her glass to his. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the night sky visible through the tall windows. "Did I ever tell you why I bought this house?" Richard asked. Suddenly, Elena shook her head. "I thought it would impress people, make them see me as successful." He smiled ruefully. "But you know what I've learned in the past 6 months? A house isn't impressive because of its size or its expensive furniture. It's impressive when it has a soul." He gestured around them. "You gave this place a soul, Elena. Your music brought it to life." "And you gave me back my dream," she replied softly. "I think we're even." As they stood together in the room that had witnessed both a thoughtless joke and a life-changing revelation, Elena realized that some journeys aren't about returning to where you started, but about finding where you truly belong. Sometimes the detours and delays aren't mistakes, but necessary parts of the path. And sometimes, the most beautiful music comes after the longest silence.